My name is Adrienne Cole. I'm 32 years old, and until 2 years ago, I worked as a pediatric trauma nurse in Chicago. Most days of my life were measured in heartbeats and quiet alarms from hospital monitors, the rhythm of machines, the sound of children breathing again after they nearly didn't. But the day my mother gave my $41 million trust fund to my younger sister, the room was silent. Not hospital silent, funeral silent. And what my mother didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that 3 days earlier the lawyer had already transferred every dollar to me, but I didn't tell them. Not yet. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it just waits. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with stories like this. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where people are listening from. Now let me take you back to the afternoon when my mother believed she had erased me from the family forever. It was October 17th. I remember the exact date because the air smelled like cold rain and old paper when I walked into the conference room at Harrison and Blythe Law Offices. A long walnut table stretched across the room. 12 leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Chicago. At the far end sat my mother, Victoria Cole. Immaculate posture, gray blazer, perfect hair. She always looked like she was attending a board meeting, even when she was destroying someone's life. Next to her sat my younger sister Daphne, 26. Perfect makeup. Diamond bracelet already on her wrist, like she'd come prepared to celebrate something. And at the head of the table sat Mr. Leonard Hale, the estate attorney who had handled my grandmother's trust for 30 years. He looked uncomfortable. That should have been my first clue. But I didn't notice yet. Because my focus was on my mother. She didn't greet me when I entered. She never did. Instead, she folded her hands and said the same sentence she'd said to me for almost 2 decades. Adrienne, I hope you understand that some children simply make better use of opportunity. Translation: Daphne deserved everything. I sat quietly. Years of hospital work had trained me to watch before reacting. Mr. Hale, my mother said crisply, please proceed with the adjustment to the trust distribution. The word adjustment felt like a blade sliding across glass. The trust fund in question had belonged to my grandmother, Eleanor Cole, who passed away 8 months earlier. She had built a private investment firm in the 1970s. By the time she died, the trust had grown to $41 million. And according to her will, it belonged to me. Not Daphne. Me. The granddaughter who spent nights studying biology while working double shifts. The granddaughter who visited her every Sunday after church. But my mother had never accepted that. To her, Daphne was the golden child. I was the administrative error. Mr. Hale cleared his throat. Mrs. Cole, before we proceed, I must clarify that the trust's terms were explicitly written by your mother. My mother waved a hand. Yes. We've discussed this already. Adrienne understands the situation. I hadn't. Until that moment. My mother turned toward me. Her voice softened slightly, the way people speak when pretending kindness. Adrienne, you've chosen a respectable profession. Nursing is admirable, but let's be realistic. Managing generational wealth requires a different skill set. Daphne smiled. That small smile, the one that said she had already won. My mother continued. Daphne will oversee the trust from now on. You'll receive a small stipend, of course. A stipend for my grandmother's life work, for the inheritance she had left specifically to me. For a moment my chest tightened so hard I thought I might faint. Not because of the money, but because of the certainty in my mother's voice. She believed she had total control. And the worst part? For most of my life, she had. Mr. Hale hesitated. Mrs. Cole, The paperwork you requested has been prepared. He slid a folder across the table. My sister leaned forward immediately, like a child opening birthday presents. I didn't move. Instead, I watched my mother sign. 1 signature, 2, 3. She pushed the documents toward Daphne. There, she said calmly. It's done. Daphne laughed quietly. I guess Grandma finally made the right decision. The room felt smaller, thicker. I could feel my pulse in my throat. But Mr. Hale still hadn't spoken. His hands rested on the table. And when he finally looked at me, there was something in his eyes. Not pity. Something closer to anticipation. My mother leaned back, satisfied. You should thank your sister, she said to me. She's willing to let you remain part of the family. Remain part of the family? I stared at the folder, at the signatures, at the smug calm spreading across Daphne's face. And then Mr. Hale slowly opened another file. A file no one else in the room had seen. He adjusted his glasses and said 5 words that would change everything. But not yet. Because the truth had been moving quietly behind the scenes for 3 days already. 3 days earlier, he had called me. And what he told me that night meant my mother had just spent 15 minutes transferring money she no longer controlled. But none of them knew that. Not my mother. Not Daphne. Not the 3 assistants standing against the wall. I sat there silently, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt patient. Because sometimes the quietest moment in a room is right before the ground breaks open. And what my mother had just done was step directly onto the fault line. People like to believe favoritism in families is subtle. A little extra praise here, a slightly bigger birthday gift there. But in our house, it wasn't subtle. It was architecture, built into the walls. I grew up in a tall white colonial house in Lake Forest, Illinois, about 40 minutes north of Chicago. The kind of neighborhood where every lawn was cut with surgical precision and every mailbox looked expensive. My mother, Victoria Cole, loved appearances. And in her world, children were appearances too. My sister Daphne was the one she displayed. I was the one she tolerated. One of my earliest memories is from when I was 8 years old. It was Christmas morning. Snow pressed against the windows, the smell of cinnamon candles floating through the living room. My father was still alive back then. He sat quietly on the couch with a mug of coffee, watching the 2 of us open presents. Daphne tore through wrapping paper like fireworks, designer dollhouses, electronic keyboards, a small gold necklace. Every few minutes, my mother would clap lightly and say, "Oh, Daphne, that suits you perfectly." Then it was my turn. I opened a thin rectangular box. Inside was a used encyclopedia set from a garage sale. I remember staring at the faded covers, trying to understand if this was a mistake. My mother noticed my confusion. "It's educational," she said flatly. Daphne leaned over my shoulder and laughed. "Books are more your speed anyway." My father looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. That silence would become the soundtrack of my childhood. By the time I was 12, the difference between us had grown obvious to everyone. Daphne had piano lessons, horseback riding, and private tutors. I had chores, lots of them. Cooking dinner when my mother stayed late at the office, cleaning the house before guests arrived, babysitting Daphne when my mother went to charity galas. If guests came over, my mother would introduce us in the same rehearsed tone every time. "This is Daphne, my bright one." Then she'd gesture vaguely toward me. "And this is Adrienne. She's practical." Practical. It was her polite word for disappointing. The strange thing is, I didn't hate my sister back then. Not really, I just thought she was lucky. Children tend to assume unfairness is normal. They don't know any other version of the world. But one person did notice. My grandmother, Eleanor Cole. She was the opposite of my mother in every possible way. Where my mother was polished, Eleanor was blunt. Where my mother cared about status, Eleanor cared about effort. Every Sunday afternoon, she'd pick me up and take me to her townhouse in the city. We would sit in her study surrounded by books and old financial journals. She loved asking questions. What did you learn this week? Which problem made you think the hardest? What scared you the most? Not many adults ask children that last question, but Eleanor did. And she always listened to the answer. One day when I was 14, she watched me solve a complicated algebra problem at her desk. She leaned back in her chair and smiled. "You're patient," she said. "Most people panic when things get complicated. You don't." Then she tapped the table softly. "Patience builds empires." At the time, I didn't understand why those words mattered, but they would echo in my mind years later, over and over again. When I turned 16, my father died, a sudden heart attack. The house grew colder after that. Not emotionally colder. There hadn't been much warmth to begin with, but structurally colder. Like something that had been holding the roof up had quietly collapsed. My mother became sharper, more controlled, more focused on grooming Daphne into the daughter she believed deserved everything. By senior year, the path was obvious. Daphne would go into business, would figure something else out. And strangely, I was okay with that. Because around that time, something happened that changed the direction of my life. During a volunteer program at a local hospital, I watched a trauma team revive a child who had stopped breathing. The room moved like choreography, precise, calm, focused. No one cared about status, only outcome. When the boy finally inhaled on his own, the entire room exhaled together. That moment hooked something deep inside me. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. So I studied harder than I ever had before. Scholarships, grants, night classes. I eventually earned my degree in pediatric trauma nursing. When I told my mother, she responded with a single sentence. "Well, someone has to do those jobs." But my grandmother was proud, very proud. She hugged me and whispered the phrase she had told me for years. Patience builds empires. By the time I was 30, my life had settled into a quiet rhythm. Long hospital shifts, coffee at 3 a.m., children who survived because a team refused to give up. I didn't think much about family politics anymore. I visited my grandmother regularly until the end, and during one of our final conversations, about 6 months before she died, she said something strange. We were sitting in her study again, the same room where she had taught me algebra years earlier. She handed me a small envelope. "Keep working," she said softly. "Your patience will matter more than you realize." I asked what she meant. She just smiled. "You'll see." I assumed she was talking about my career, about life in general. I had no idea she had already rewritten something that would shake our entire family, because 3 months later, she passed away. And when the will was first read, my mother's expression had frozen. Not angry, not shocked, something closer to threatened. That was the first moment I realized something bigger had happened. But I still didn't understand how far my mother would go to correct what she believed was a mistake, or how determined she was to take that inheritance away from me. And the day she finally decided to do it, the day she called the lawyer and arranged that meeting in the conference room, would become the moment everything in our family finally broke open. But the real betrayal, the one that shattered whatever fragile bond we had left, was still coming. Because what my mother did next wasn't just manipulation, it was something far more deliberate and far more cruel. The first time my mother tried to take the trust fund from me, she didn't do it quietly. She did it publicly, deliberately. and in a way that made it clear she believed I had no power to stop her. But to understand how that day unfolded, you need to go back about 6 weeks before the meeting at the lawyer's office. Because that's when the pressure started. It began with a phone call. I had just finished a 14-hour shift at the hospital. My scrubs smelled like antiseptic and cafeteria coffee, and I was halfway to my car when my phone buzzed. Mom. She rarely called. Usually she sent short texts that sounded like business memos. So I answered. Hello? Her voice was calm. Too calm. Adrienne, we need to discuss your grandmother's trust. I leaned against my car door. What about it? You're listed as the primary beneficiary, she said. Yes. A pause. Then she said the sentence that would begin unraveling everything. That arrangement needs to change. Not should change. Not could change. Needs. I rubbed my forehead. Grandma wrote the will herself. Yes, my mother replied evenly. And she made mistakes. That word again. Mistakes. She meant me. She left the fund to you because she felt sorry for you, my mother continued. But that money belongs in capable hands. Meaning, Daphne's hands. I stayed quiet. Years of growing up in that house had taught me that arguing with my mother only made her more determined. Finally, I said, What exactly are you asking? I want you to sign a transfer agreement, she said. Just like that. A legal surrender. I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it felt unreal. You want me to give away $41 million? Yes. Her voice didn't change. You don't need that kind of responsibility. Daphne does. There it was. The lifelong equation. Daphne equals success. Adrienne equals temporary placeholder. I took a slow breath. No. 3 seconds of silence followed. Then she hung up. The next week became a quiet war. My mother called repeatedly. At first, she tried persuasion. You'll still receive support. Then guilt. Your sister has plans for the family legacy. Then criticism. You've always been stubborn. Eventually, she stopped pretending kindness. You're being selfish. That one almost made me laugh again. A pediatric nurse working double shifts being called selfish by someone fighting to control $41 million. But the calls didn't stop. Sometimes she left voicemails. Sometimes she sent emails filled with legal language. Once she even mailed a transfer contract to my apartment. The document was 23 pages long. All it required was my signature, and everything would belong to Daphne. I threw it away. 2 weeks later, something changed. The calls stopped. Completely. No texts. No messages. Nothing. At first, I thought maybe my mother had finally accepted reality. But then something strange happened. A certified letter arrived at my apartment. Inside was a notice from Harrison and Blythe Law offices, a formal meeting request regarding trust management adjustments. The wording felt cold, calculated. I called the office immediately. Mr. Hale answered. His voice sounded tense. Adrienne, thank you for calling. What's this meeting about? He hesitated, then said something that made my stomach tighten. Your mother has requested an amendment to the trust structure. That's not possible, I said. The will is clear. Another pause. Yes, he replied carefully. It is. That tone. It carried the weight of something unsaid. I asked the question slowly. Is there something you're not telling me? Silence stretched across the phone. Finally, he said, Would you be available to speak privately tomorrow evening? Privately? Yes. Why? Another pause. Then he said a sentence that still echoes in my mind. Because your grandmother anticipated this. The next night I drove to his office. After hours. The building was nearly empty. Only one light glowed inside the conference room. Mr. Hale stood by the window when I entered. He looked tired, older than I remembered. "Thank you for coming," he said. "What's going on?" I asked. He closed the door. Then he walked to the table and placed a sealed envelope in front of me. "This was left with me by your grandmother 6 months before she passed." I frowned. "Why give it to you instead of me?" "Because she knew your mother would challenge the will." That sentence made my chest tighten. "She told me," he continued, "that if any attempt was made to redirect the trust, I should open this." My hands suddenly felt cold. Open it. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, typed, signed, witnessed, a legal directive. Mr. Hale spoke quietly as I read. "Your grandmother placed a contingency clause in the trust structure." My eyes moved across the page, the words slowly forming meaning. If any beneficiary attempted to interfere with the primary inheritance allocation, the assets would immediately be transferred and secured under the direct control of Adrienne Cole. Effective immediately, no further authorization required. My heart started pounding. "Wait," I said slowly. "Are you saying—" "Yes." Mr. Hale nodded. "The transfer occurred 3 days ago." I stared at him. "All of it?" "All of it." The room felt strangely quiet, like the world had tilted slightly. My grandmother had known. She had predicted my mother's move before it even happened, and she had already protected me. Mr. Hale slid another document across the table. "Your accounts have been established. The funds are secured under your authority. $41 million. Already mine. Already safe. Already beyond my mother's reach." Then he said something unexpected. "There's just one complication." "What?" "Your mother still believes the trust hasn't been transferred." I looked up. "And she's planning that meeting next week." He nodded slowly. "She intends to move the entire trust to Daphne." A strange calm spread through me. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. "So let her try," I said. Mr. Hale studied my face. "You don't want to stop her?" I shook my head. "No." Because suddenly I understood something my grandmother had known for years. Some lessons can't be explained. They have to reveal themselves. And sometimes the truth doesn't need to fight. Sometimes it just waits. Quietly. Until the moment someone proudly announces a victory. That never existed. And 6 weeks later, in that conference room, my mother had just signed the documents giving my sister control of money that had already left the trust. She leaned back in her chair, satisfied, certain she had corrected the world. But Mr. Hale had just opened a second file, and the sentence he spoke next was about to turn that certainty into something else entirely. Before the truth exploded in that conference room, before my mother realized the money had already moved, there were years of my life she believed had broken me. Years where she thought I had failed. Years where she assumed I had become exactly what she always predicted. A disappointment. But those were the years that built the strongest part of me. And the strange thing is, my mother helped create them, just not in the way she intended. After my grandmother's funeral, the distance between me and my family became absolute. No dramatic fight. No screaming. Just silence. My mother stopped inviting me to holidays. Daphne blocked my number. The family group chat quietly disappeared from my phone. I remember the first Christmas after the funeral. I worked a double shift at the hospital, not because I had to, because I didn't want to sit alone in my apartment listening to the quiet. Hospitals are strange places during holidays. They're filled with two types of people: families hoping, and professionals trying not to lose anyone. I preferred being in the second group. At least there, the rules made sense. If you worked hard enough, sometimes people lived. Money had never been the center of my life, so when my grandmother's will named me as the beneficiary of the trust, I didn't suddenly change how I lived. I kept my small 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park. I drove the same aging Honda I'd owned since nursing school, and I kept working night shifts. People assume that when someone inherits wealth, their life transforms overnight. Mine didn't. Mostly because I still felt like the same girl who had grown up opening garage sale encyclopedias on Christmas morning. Except now I had something that girl didn't. Confidence. Not loud confidence. Quiet confidence. The kind that forms slowly after years of solving problems under pressure. At 3:17 a.m. in trauma rooms, when a child's heart monitor suddenly goes flat. If you've ever worked in an environment like that, you know something important. Panic doesn't save people. Patience does. Patience builds empires. My grandmother's words. About 4 months after the funeral, I met someone who would quietly change the trajectory of my life. His name was Dr. Marcus Ellery. He was a senior trauma surgeon at the hospital. Brilliant, blunt, and almost impossible to impress. The first time we worked together was during a complicated emergency surgery on a 7-year-old boy who had been in a car accident. The room was chaos. Machines beeping, residents rushing, nurses calling numbers. But Marcus moved slowly, methodically, like a chess player studying the board. At one point, he glanced at me and said calmly, "Cole, what's the oxygen trend?" I gave the numbers instantly. Then he asked 3 more questions. Each time I answered before the residents could. After the surgery ended successfully, he removed his gloves and studied me. "How long have you been doing trauma?" 6 years." He nodded. "You don't panic." I smiled faintly. "Neither do you." He laughed once. A rare sound. Then he said something that stayed with me. "Most people think intelligence wins crises. It doesn't." "What does?" "Patience." I almost laughed when he said it, because it was the exact word my grandmother had used my entire life. Patience builds empires. Over the next year, Marcus became something close to a mentor. Not formally, just quietly. He would ask my opinion during complex cases, encourage me to pursue advanced certifications, push me to take leadership shifts. One night after a particularly brutal emergency shift, we sat in the empty staff lounge drinking terrible coffee. He looked at me thoughtfully. "You're wasting potential staying in the same role forever." "I like my job." "I know," he said, "but you think bigger than this." I shrugged. "I'm a nurse." "You're a strategist," replied. That word surprised me. Strategist. It wasn't something anyone in my family had ever called me. Then he asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you invest?" "Invest?" "In markets," he said. "Real estate, startups, anything." I shook my head. "No." He leaned back. "You should." I laughed. "On a nurse's salary?" Marcus gave me a curious look. "Money isn't the barrier most people think it is." Then he said something that would eventually connect to everything that happened later. Strategy compounds just like capital. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. But that conversation planted something in my mind. Over the following months, I started learning. Quietly. Reading financial reports. Studying investment structures. Understanding how trusts worked. How wealth moved. How people tried to control it. And strangely enough, I found it fascinating. Because markets and trauma rooms had something in common. Both punished panic. Both rewarded patience. Patience builds empires. Meanwhile, my mother assumed I had disappeared into mediocrity. Once or twice a year, I would hear through distant relatives that Daphne had started helping manage family finances. My mother told people she was preparing Daphne to lead the family legacy. No one mentioned me. I had become the quiet footnote in the family story, and for a long time, I let them believe that. Because there's a strange freedom in being underestimated. No expectations, No scrutiny. Just space. Space to grow. Space to observe. Space to become someone stronger than they ever imagined. And when my mother finally decided to take the trust fund away from me, she was operating under the same assumption she had carried for decades: that Adrienne Cole was still the quiet girl in the corner, the one who accepted whatever scraps the family handed her. What she didn't realize was that girl had spent years learning how systems worked, how pressure exposed weakness, how patience changed outcomes. And when the confrontation finally arrived, I wouldn't be reacting emotionally. I would be watching, waiting, because the moment she believed she had won was the moment everything would start to unravel. And sitting in that conference room, watching my mother proudly sign those documents, I realized something important. She hadn't changed. She was still playing the same game she had played my entire life: control, manipulation, certainty. But this time, she had stepped onto a board where the rules had already changed, and she didn't even know it yet. For most of my life, my mother believed something very simple about me. She believed that without her approval, I would stall. That without the family structure around me, I would drift. That without her control, I would fail quietly somewhere in the background of the world. And, for a while, it probably looked exactly like that. Because my life didn't explode into success after my grandmother passed. There were no dramatic transformations, no luxury cars, no sudden displays of wealth. Just quiet progress. The kind no one notices. But the truth about quiet progress is that it compounds. Just like patience. Patience builds empires. About a year after my grandmother died, something unexpected happened. I received a call from Mr. Leonard Hale. Not about the trust, about something else. "Adrienne," he said, "there's something your grandmother left in addition to the trust documentation." "What is it?" "A list." "A list?" "Yes." He sounded almost amused. "A list of companies she believed would shape the next 20 years of the economy." That immediately caught my attention. My grandmother had built her wealth through strategic investing. She didn't gamble. She studied. She watched. And when she moved early. I met Mr. Hale at his office a few days later. He handed me a folder. Inside were handwritten notes. Pages of them. Technology firms. Healthcare logistics startups. Medical supply chains. Even early-stage biotech companies. Some of the names meant nothing to me. Others I had already seen mentioned in industry journals. "This was written 3 years before she passed," Mr. Hale explained. "Why give it to me?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "Because she believed you were the only person in the family patient enough to understand it." That sentence hit deeper than he probably realized. For the next several months, I spent my free time studying those companies, researching their leadership, their financials, their growth potential. I wasn't trying to become a billionaire. I was just curious. But curiosity has a way of turning into strategy, and strategy has a way of creating momentum. Around the same time, my relationship with Dr. Marcus Ellery continued to evolve. We still worked together frequently in the trauma unit, but our conversations started expanding beyond medicine. One night around 2:40 a.m., after a brutal emergency shift, we sat in the empty hospital cafeteria. Marcus looked exhausted, but thoughtful. "You've changed this year," he said. "How?" "You're thinking differently." I stirred my coffee. "I've been studying investments." That made him smile. "Good. You expected that?" "Yes." "Why?" He leaned back in his chair. "Because people who stay calm in chaos tend to see patterns other people miss." He paused. "You're one of those people." I laughed quietly. "You're giving me too much credit." Marcus shook his head. "No, I'm not. Then he asked something surprising. Have you considered leaving bedside nursing eventually? The idea felt strange. Hospitals had been my entire adult life. I don't know what I'd do instead. You'd build something, he said simply. That sentence stayed with me long after that night. Because part of me knew he was right. Not immediately, but someday. Meanwhile, the trust fund sat quietly in the background of my life. I didn't touch most of it. Instead, under Mr. Hale's guidance, it remained structured in diversified investments, real estate, equity funds, private medical logistics ventures. My grandmother had designed the system carefully, not for rapid spending, for long-term growth. And every quarterly report confirmed something remarkable. The trust wasn't just stable, it was growing, slowly, steadily, like a living thing expanding under the surface. But my mother didn't know any of this. To her, the trust was still something she could eventually control, and that belief shaped everything she did next. About 6 months before the confrontation at the law office, something curious happened. A distant cousin mentioned at a family gathering that Daphne had started telling people she would soon be managing the Cole Trust Fund. Apparently, my mother had been saying the same thing in social circles. She's preparing Daphne to oversee the inheritance, the cousin explained casually. I remember smiling politely, not correcting him. Because sometimes the most powerful position in a conversation is silence. If you've ever been underestimated before, you know exactly what I mean. Tell me in the comments what you would have done. Would you have corrected them? Or would you have waited? A few weeks later, I received the phone call from my mother. The one where she demanded I sign over the trust. And suddenly, everything made sense. The social rumors, the pressure, the sudden urgency. My mother had already decided the money belonged to Daphne. All she needed was my signature to make it official. But when I refused, she escalated. That escalation led to the private meeting with Mr. Hale, which led to the discovery of my grandmother's contingency clause, which led to the complete transfer of the trust fund into my control 3 days before the conference room meeting. But even knowing the outcome was already secured, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt curious, because I wanted to see something. I wanted to see what my mother would do when she believed she still had power, and more importantly, what she would do when that power disappeared. So when the day of the meeting arrived, I walked into that conference room calmly, not angry, not defensive, just observant. My mother spoke confidently. Daphne smiled like a woman about to inherit a kingdom. Mr. Hale remained quiet, and when the documents were signed, my mother leaned back in her chair, satisfied. You should thank your sister, she told me. She's willing to let you remain part of the family. Remain part of the family, I remember thinking about that sentence, about how strange it sounded after everything that had already happened. Then Mr. Hale opened the second file and finally spoke. Mrs. Cole, he said carefully, there's one detail you should be aware of. My mother frowned slightly. What detail? Mr. Hale adjusted his glasses, then delivered the sentence that would begin dismantling everything she believed she had just accomplished. There's a very specific kind of silence that happens right before people realize they've made a catastrophic mistake. Not confusion, not shock, something quieter. The silence of certainty beginning to fracture. That's the silence that filled the conference room the moment Mr. Leonard Hale adjusted his glasses and looked at my mother. My mother sat back in her chair, completely relaxed. Daphne was still smiling, one hand resting on the folder that supposedly gave her control of the Cole Trust. They believed the meeting was finished. They believed they had just rewritten my grandmother's will. They believed I had lost. And for a few seconds, no one said anything. Then Mr. Hale spoke. Mrs. Cole, he said carefully, Before these documents are finalized, there is a matter of timing that must be clarified. My mother frowned slightly. What do you mean? Mr. Hale folded his hands together on the table. The trust fund referenced in these documents, he paused, is no longer held in the structure you attempted to modify. The room didn't react immediately, because the sentence didn't fully land yet. My mother tilted her head slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. Mr. Hale turned one page in the file in front of him. The Cole family trust was automatically transferred 3 days ago under a contingency clause written by Eleanor Cole. Daphne's smile faded. My mother's posture stiffened. What clause? Mr. Hale slid a document across the table. The one your mother added to the trust agreement 6 months before her passing. My mother picked up the paper. At first she skimmed it. Then she read it again, more slowly. I watched the exact moment the meaning reached her. Her shoulders tightened. What is this? Mr. Hale answered calmly. It's the protective clause your mother designed in the event anyone attempted to alter the trust distribution. Daphne leaned closer. What does that mean? Mr. Hale didn't raise his voice, but every word landed like a stone. It means the trust fund was legally transferred into the direct control of the original beneficiary. My mother's eyes snapped toward him. And who is that? He looked at me, then back at her. Adrienne Cole. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever experienced in an operating room. My mother stared at the paper, then at the folder Daphne had just celebrated, then back at Mr. Hale. That's impossible. It's already been executed, he replied. The transfer was completed 72 hours ago. Daphne shook her head. No, that can't be right. My mother pushed the document away like it had burned her. You should have informed us. Mr. Hale remained composed. The clause required immediate execution once interference with the trust was attempted. Her eyes narrowed. Interference? Yes. He turned the document toward her again and pointed to a paragraph. Your request to redirect the trust triggered the clause automatically. Daphne looked from him to my mother. Wait, so the money, Mr. Hale finished the sentence for her, is already under Adrienne's authority. No one moved, not even the assistant standing near the wall. My mother slowly turned toward me. For the first time that afternoon, she actually looked uncertain. You knew about this? I nodded once. Yes. Daphne stared at me. You let us sit here and sign all this paperwork knowing it meant nothing? I answered honestly. You were very determined to finish. That was when the anger arrived. Fast. Sharp. My mother's voice rose. This is absurd. The trust was meant for the family. It still is, Mr. Hale said calmly, under the terms Eleanor established. That woman was manipulated, my mother snapped. Mr. Hale didn't respond. Instead, he turned another document toward her. This contains Eleanor Cole's personal statement attached to the clause. My mother grabbed the paper. Her eyes scanned it quickly, then slower. I knew exactly what it said because I had read it earlier that week. My grandmother's final message. Not emotional, not dramatic, just direct. If anyone attempts to remove Adrienne from this inheritance, it confirms exactly why she deserves it. The room felt smaller. Daphne's face had turned pale. My mother placed the document down very carefully. This can still be challenged. Mr. Hale nodded slightly. You're welcome to pursue legal review. And what are the chances of reversing it? She asked. Mr. Hale's answer was calm. Very low. Define low. He looked at her directly. Nearly impossible. Daphne leaned back in her chair like the air had left her lungs. But the trust. It belongs to Adrienne, Mr. Hale said again. No anger, no drama, just fact. My mother looked at me again, and something in her expression had changed. Not rage, calculation. the same expression she used when negotiating business deals. "You don't know how to manage this kind of money," she said. I didn't react. "I've managed critical care teams during mass casualty emergencies," I replied quietly. "I think I can manage a portfolio." Daphne shook her head. "You're a nurse." "Yes." My voice stayed calm. "And, apparently a beneficiary." For a moment no one spoke. Then my mother stood. Her chair scraped against the floor. "This meeting is over." But Mr. Hale didn't move. "There's one more matter," he said. She turned sharply. "What now?" He opened the final page of the file. "The trust structure also includes operational authority over the Cole family investment holdings." My mother's expression froze. "What does that mean?" Mr. Hale looked at me, then back at her. "It means Adrienne now holds voting control over the majority of those assets." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Because suddenly this wasn't just about inheritance. It was about power. Real power. And my mother had just realized something that had never happened before in our entire lives. For the first time, she was no longer the one in control. But the full consequences of that shift hadn't even begun yet. Because what my mother would attempt, next, was far more desperate. And far more revealing. If you've ever watched someone realize their control is slipping away, you know how uncomfortable that moment can be. Type karma in the comments if you believe the truth eventually catches up with people. Because what happened next was the moment the entire story my mother had built about our family finally collapsed. The strange thing about power is that when someone loses it, they rarely admit it immediately. They try to rewrite the situation first. Spin it. Reframe it. Pretend the ground beneath them hasn't shifted. That's exactly what my mother tried to do in that conference room. For about 30 seconds after Mr. Hale explained the trust transfer, she stood perfectly still. Then the strategist in her woke up. Her posture straightened. Her voice cooled. "This is clearly a misunderstanding," she said. It wasn't anger anymore. It was negotiation. I had seen that tone before when she spoke to investors or board members. "We can resolve this privately," she continued, turning toward me. "You don't need to involve attorneys." Mr. Hale didn't interrupt. He simply closed the folder and folded his hands. My mother stepped closer to the table. "Adrienne," she said, softening her voice slightly. "Your grandmother made decisions based on emotion near the end of her life." That sentence hung in the air. Daphne watched me carefully, waiting. My mother continued. "You know managing this kind of wealth requires experience." I didn't respond. "You're a nurse," she added gently, as if reminding me of my place in the hierarchy she had built my entire life. "We can fix this together." That word again. Together. The same woman who had excluded me from holidays now suddenly wanted partnership. It would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. Mr. Hale finally spoke. "The trust terms are not subject to negotiation, unless Adrienne initiates that process." My mother didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on me. "You don't understand what this responsibility involves." I leaned back slightly in my chair. "Try me." That surprised her. I could see it. For most of my life, I would have avoided confrontation. But the calm that comes from knowing the truth is on your side is very different from defensive anger. It doesn't rush. It waits. Patience builds empires. My grandmother had repeated that phrase for years. And suddenly, I understood why. My mother placed both hands on the table. "Let's speak plainly," she said. "The Cole investments are part of our family legacy." I nodded once. "They are. And you don't have the background to manage them properly." Mr. Hale glanced toward me but remained silent. I looked directly at my mother. "You mean I don't have the background you expected?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What does that mean?" It was the first time during the entire meeting that she had asked a genuine question. So I answered it. I've been studying the trust structure for months, I said. That caught her off guard. The asset distribution, the investment allocations, the board agreements. Daphne frowned. You've been looking at that? Yes. My mother crossed her arms. And you believe reading documents qualifies you to control generational wealth? No. I paused. But patience does. That phrase again? My grandmother's phrase. My mother recognized it immediately. Her jaw tightened. Your grandmother filled your head with ideas, she said sharply. No, I replied quietly. She prepared me. That was the moment something inside my mother cracked. Not emotionally, strategically, because she realized something she had never considered before. I wasn't reacting like the daughter she remembered. I was responding like someone who already understood the board. And that meant the conversation had moved to a place she couldn't easily control. Daphne tried a different angle. You're not actually going to keep all that money, she said. The way she said it wasn't a question. It was disbelief. I looked at her. Why not? Because it belongs to the family. It was left to me. That's not the same thing. For the first time, I felt a small flicker of sadness. Not anger, just recognition. My sister had grown up believing the same narrative my mother had repeated for decades, that some people were meant to inherit power, and others were meant to stand nearby and watch. If you've ever experienced something like that in your own family, you know how deep those stories run. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to break away from expectations someone else wrote for you. My mother exhaled slowly. Then she made her final attempt. If you insist on holding the trust, she said carefully, then Daphne and I will expect oversight authority. Mr. Hale immediately shook his head. That authority rests solely with Adrienne under the trust structure. My mother turned toward him sharply. You're her attorney. I was your mother's attorney, he corrected gently. Another silence filled the room, this one heavier than the last. Because the illusion had finally collapsed. My mother could no longer pretend the situation was temporary. The power structure had shifted. Completely. But she still had one more card to play. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the sharpest edge yet. You realize, she said slowly, that this decision will separate you from this family permanently. There it was. The oldest weapon she had ever used. Belonging. Or the threat of losing it. For most of my life, that sentence would have crushed me. But sitting there in that conference room, I realized something quietly powerful. I had already built a life outside that structure, a life where my worth wasn't measured by my mother's approval. So when I answered her, my voice stayed calm. I think that separation happened a long time ago. Daphne stared at me. My mother didn't respond immediately. And for the first time in decades, she had no argument left. No leverage. No control. But the full consequences of that moment were still unfolding. Because what happened next would expose something far bigger than the trust fund. Something my grandmother had predicted years earlier. And once that truth surfaced, there would be no way for my mother to rebuild the story she had told everyone about our family. After my mother said that sentence, this decision will separate you from this family permanently. No one in the conference room spoke for a while. The silence wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just the slow realization that the story my mother had controlled for decades had ended. She stood near the end of the conference table, perfectly composed on the outside. But the certainty she carried into the room was gone. Daphne stared down at the paperwork she had celebrated minutes earlier, like it had suddenly become meaningless. Mr. Hale closed the final folder, and for the first time since the meeting began, he leaned back slightly. The legal work was finished. Everything else now was simply consequence. My mother picked up her purse. "You've made your position clear," she said to me. Her voice was controlled again, professional. The same tone she used when ending a negotiation she had lost. But before she turned toward the door, Mr. Hale spoke one more time. "There is one final document attached to the trust," he said. My mother paused. Slowly. "What document?" Mr. Hale slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "This was your mother's final instruction regarding the trust's purpose." My mother hesitated, then picked it up. Daphne leaned over to read with her. I had already seen the document earlier that week when Mr. Hale showed me the full file, but watching my mother read it for the first time was something else entirely. Because the words were not legal language. They were personal. My grandmother had written them herself. And they said something very simple. Wealth does not exist to reward entitlement. It exists to reward patience, responsibility, and character. Below that line was another sentence, one directed specifically at my mother. If Adrienne receives this trust, it means she has already shown more strength than anyone realizes. My mother read those lines twice, then folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the table. She didn't comment. She didn't argue. For once, she had nothing to correct. Daphne was the one who broke the silence. "So that's it?" she asked. Her voice sounded smaller now. "You're just walking away with everything?" I looked at her. "No." She frowned. "What do you mean?" I rested my hands lightly on the table. "The trust wasn't designed to sit in an account forever." Daphne blinked. "Then what are you doing with it?" That question had been forming in my mind ever since the night Mr. Hale showed me my grandmother's full plan, and the answer had become clearer over the past few weeks. "I'm building something with it." My mother finally looked up. "What kind of thing?" I answered honestly. "Medical infrastructure." That confused them. Hospitals, emergency transport networks, trauma training programs, the kinds of systems that saved lives long before patients reached an operating table. The kinds of systems my grandmother believed were underfunded for decades. "I'm expanding the investments your mother started," I said to my mother. "Just in a different direction." She studied me for a moment, trying to measure whether I truly meant it. Then she said quietly, "You're turning a family investment fund into charity." "No," I replied. "I'm turning it into something useful." Mr. Hale smiled slightly at that. My mother didn't argue again. Instead, she straightened her jacket. And for the first time since I was a child, she looked at me like I was someone she didn't fully understand. "Very well," she said. Then she walked toward the door. Daphne followed her, but before leaving, my sister turned back once. "Do you think Grandma knew this would happen?" The answer was easy. "Yes." Daphne frowned. "How?" I thought about my grandmother sitting in that study years earlier, watching me solve math problems slowly, patiently, then repeating the phrase she loved more than any other. "Patience builds empires." She understood people, I said simply. Daphne didn't respond. Then, she left. The conference room felt strangely peaceful after they were gone. Mr. Hale gathered the documents and placed them into a leather portfolio. "You handled that well," he said. "I learned patience from a good teacher." He nodded. "Your grandmother would have liked how that ended." I wasn't so sure about that, because endings are rarely clean. Families don't repair themselves in a single afternoon. And I wasn't expecting reconciliation, but something important had changed. For the first time in my life, my story wasn't being written by someone else. 6 months later, the first project funded by the trust opened in a small hospital network outside Chicago, a trauma training center. Advanced equipment. Scholarships for nurses specializing in emergency care. On the wall of the main training room, a small plaque was installed. It didn't list the size of the fund. It didn't mention family names. It just carried a sentence. The one my grandmother had repeated for years: patience builds empires. Sometimes when I walk through that building late at night, after a long shift, I stop and look at those words. And I think about that conference room, about the moment my mother believed she had taken everything from me, when in reality, the most important thing she ever taught me was how to survive without her approval. And that turned out to be the one advantage she could never take away. If you've ever been underestimated or pushed aside in your own family, remember something: the quiet ones aren't weak. Sometimes they're just waiting for the moment patience finally reveals what was always true. Because in the end, the truth doesn't shout, it simply arrives. And when it does, everything changes. If this story stayed with you until the end, thank you for listening. Stories like this remind us that patience, truth, and quiet strength always have a way of revealing themselves, even when people try to rewrite the story. If you connected with Adrienne's journey, type "Patience Builds Empires" in the comments. I read every comment and I love seeing your thoughts and where you're listening from around the world. And if you enjoy powerful real lifestyle stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. There's another story waiting for you right here on the channel. And trust me, the next one might be even more unbelievable.